So in this episode of our new construction series that we are doing on our YouTube channel, today we are going to be discussing the top 5 things to do before you even get a construction loan or even think about building new construction. And of course, on this YouTube series, we have our special guest, Manny, which is a local construction lender here in Sarasota County, Manatee County, Charlotte County, just the general greater Sarasota area. So like I said, we are going to be discussing the 5 things that everyone needs to be doing before they even get a construction loan or even think about building new construction in this area. So thank you very much, Manny, for joining us on this episode.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on here. It's pretty cool. So these are the top 5 things you want to do. And number 1, I can't emphasize enough, it's kind of mind-boggling how many people don't think as this to be step number 1. And the obvious is to apply, and know what you're working with.
Yeah.
Many people want to go out and talk to the builder, talk to the realtor, and look at what's enticing, but don't necessarily know if they can afford it or not. And that takes a huge stress off the process once you know what you're working with.
Yep.
So I always tell people to apply with ample time ahead of time. Even if you're kind of just on the fence and you're not 100% positive that you do want to apply, I still suggest you do, because that's where you catch a lot of the things that you need to either get in line or things are in line.
Right.
But you don't want to be in a situation where you're under contract, you have plans, and all of a sudden your deal starts to fall apart because now you're doing your due diligence by applying and submitting documentation.
Right.
So number 1 is definitely apply with ample time.
Right. So then, yeah, we'll dive into that a little bit. So I know us being a builder here in Sarasota is that, I know we've mentioned this again on other episodes, but it's basically like people approach us like, hey, we're looking to build, a 3-bed, 2-bath house, 2,500 square foot house, what can we build this for, and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what we can build it for. It's basically what they can afford at that time, right? So a lot of I've run into this myself too, being a real estate agent, going down to Northport, checking out other builders. Before I partnered up with Josh to build houses, was that I would approach them, talking with them about that. And as being a real estate agent, obviously they give me a little bit more information than the typical consumer. However, the biggest thing that they said and they've mentioned is that it's great that people come in to talk with them, but at the end of the day, they're not going to be much help because, if they're like, oh, I really want this and this is all I can do.
Right.
But then at the same time, the builder's like, well, we really can't help you unless they know exactly what budget they're working in, because they're very cognizant of their time. They want to be cognizant of, a consumer's time as well and not waste either time. And I feel like that's just the biggest thing, at least when people approach us too, is building, we're looking to build this house. And then realistically, most of the time, the budgets that they give are unrealistic to the prices of today's current market. Now, prices do change and stuff like that. Prices are shifting, which is why we are starting to figure out new, more affordable ways of building houses in Northport. That's kind of the initiative of why we started building houses and custom houses here in Sarasota, was trying to figure out a more affordable way to build houses, something that's a little bit more stronger and durable than your typical concrete block and, wood trusses. So we've been working towards that, working with a steel manufacturer and stuff like that to really figure out how we can best help people while creating affordable housing and then also create a structure that can hold up to 220 mile an hour hurricane rated winds, right? And if we have 220 mile hurricane rated winds, we're in for a bigger issue than the structure falling over.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that you do bring up a very valid point about that is, just making sure that you know what you can afford and making sure that you get approved and stuff like that before you even talk with a builder, even though it's great to talk with a builder, but it's always good to get approved.
It's kind of one of those rarities that just most people fall in love with the product first and they don't even really analyze how. They just know they're going to get it, but sometimes they don't realize that you have to take several steps to get there. So
exactly.
Definitely a great practice to apply first.
So besides applying, what would you say is the second major thing that people should always be doing before they even get a construction?
Absolutely. So I'd say the second thing kind of ties in with the first thing. It's gathering your documentation. And really, this actually could be step 1, is gathering your docs and maybe as you apply, you present those docs. That takes a lot of the legwork out of the approval process, is having your income documents in line, your last 2 years tax returns if you're self-employed, or if you're a W-2 employee, then get the last 2 years. I always tell people, think of the magic number 2. It's typically going to be the last 2 years of the tax returns, last 2 years of W-2s, last 2 months of asset statements, and they typically want to see 30 days of pay stubs if you're an employee, but you can also think of 2 in that sense. When you gather that documentation and you meet with your lender, that takes a big load off of you as a client and the lender. Because that is a big part of the process, a huge component. So I would say 1 and 2 are relatively similar by applying with ample amount of time, and number 2 being have your documentation in line.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like those two just really go hand in hand between having your proper documentation and getting approved, or figuring out what you really can afford besides just winging it out of left field and say that you can buy a $600,000 house.
Absolutely. I can't emphasize enough on, meeting with your lender and doing an application is one thing, but meeting with your lender and having your documentation in line, and an experienced, knowledgeable lender will go off of your documentation. Right. Many self-employed clients, are under the impression that they make X amount, and a lot of times they often do, but then when it comes to deductions, the income is a lot lower. Right. So the qualifying process can take a bad turn from that point on. So it's definitely important to have those docs.
Right. Gotcha. All right. So yeah, besides, figuring out your proper documentation, getting approved, what would you say is the third thing that everyone needs to be doing?
The third thing is getting that pre-approval versus the PreQual, which also ties to 1 and 2. But there is a difference in being pre-approved and being pre-qualified. Being pre-qualified is actually giving your documentation and submitting it, not just meeting with the lender, going through the application, and it's an hour process. Typically, to get approved will typically take about anywhere from 24 to 72 hours for credit, income, and assets. Property, that's a whole nother underwriting time frame.
Right. Gotcha. All right. So the biggest thing between, a pre-approval and a pre-qualification is that basically a pre-approval is a more in-depth, where they look at all your financials, they look at all your numbers and everything like that, versus a pre-qualification is more so they tell you what they have and stuff like that. It's more generic overview versus a pre-approval. But at the end of the day, whether you're submitting an offer on a house or even looking to build a new construction house, you always need a pre-approval. It's great to have a pre-qual, but at the same time, you need that pre-approval to even move forward and buying a house or even building a house.
Exactly. A pre-qual is more at a glance. Pre-approval is more in depth.
Right. Gotcha. Okay.
Absolutely.
Gotcha.
Absolutely. I'd say the fourth thing is knowing your budgets. And that comes into play after you do the due diligence with the financials. So knowing the cost of construction is a critical component, because in order for the lender to give you a better idea on what your structure of the loan will be, is knowing the cost of construction. With that, I'd say you want to know your plans and specs as well. That would probably be your fifth to-do thing, to make sure you kind of have an idea of what your costs are, and then fifth being your plans and specs.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I feel like the plans and specs really go hand in hand, because if you don't know, or I should say, if you know that you really need to have a 3-bed, 2-bath, very minimum, but you would like a 2,500 square foot, but you really can get away with an 1,800 square foot, you really need to dial that in. But once again, that comes back to getting pre-approved to know what exactly your financials are, how much you can afford, because that'll dictate, even though it's nice to have more room, but at the end of the day, in reality, that you may only be able to build an 18 or 2,000 square foot house. So it's really pros and cons of what are your must-haves and what are your want-to-haves. And that's what I tell people is like, depending even on specs and finishes, is like, okay, would you rather have, it's nice to have level 7 quartz, but at the same time, it's a must-have for you to at least have a level 2 quartz.
Correct.
So anything in between is a great thing, but if you really need a level 2 quartz, you got to really know your finations before doing that, because you may be buying a granite slab versus a quartz slab, depending on your financials.
Yes, I've just learned that myself. Between marble and granite. Absolutely.
And so, I know. I feel like the biggest thing too is, even though the specs are good, but at the end of the day, the finishes are what cost the most amount of money. And this is where people can go wild. And this is where people look on builders' websites. They ask us, okay, well, what can you build this house for?
Exactly.
But at the same time, I'm like, okay, what are your finishes? Do you want quartz? Do you want granite? Do you want marble? Do you want LVP? Do you want tile flooring? Do you want wood flooring? Do you want carpet?
Absolutely.
It's all those finishes because, yes, we can build a shell of a house for the same price of everyone.
Right.
But at the same time, what are your finishes? Because finishes right now, you could spend additional 10 to 25% of the base price of the shell of the house on upgrades. And a lot of people don't realize that, especially when you go to a tract home builder. Yes. Their typical average is about 20% of the base price of their house. So if it starts at $400,000, you have to add in the lot cost, then you have to add in the upgrade costs, and that can all just add up at the end of the day.
Exactly. Not knowing your costs can really backfire. Right. That's definitely imperative to the transaction. Absolutely.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, I think that sums up the 5 things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think as long as you know those top 5, you're ready to start the process and enjoy the process, more importantly. And I think if there's a takeaway to take away from these top 5 things, is that if you do these top 5 things, it just makes the process that much more pleasurable.
Right. I feel like the new construction process can be a headache if you don't, get your ducks in a row and you don't follow the proper steps and you're working backwards from there, and it can be an unvery pleasant process. So thank you very much, Manny, for talking about, the 5 things that everyone needs to know about before getting a construction loan to make your new construction process as smooth as possible. And if you guys are looking to move into the Sarasota area, Northport area, Venice area, whatever that may be, I myself came from Wisconsin as a real estate agent, and I had a lot of questions that I couldn't get answered just by Googling it online. So I wanted to create a perspective, because probably most of you are probably from out of state. You're looking to buy, build a house, your second home, maybe it's even your primary house. What we have done is we create a buyer's relocation guide for both Sarasota and Northport, talking about, the top 10 things to do, the best place to eat, the best places to stay, what are some things you can do with your furry friend, and so much more. So make sure that you guys go and check that out. The links are down at the bottom of this description in this video. And thank you very much, Manny, for talking with us today. And if you guys want to stay more in tune with our upcoming episodes about the new construction process, don't forget to hit that subscribe button down at the bottom of this video as well. But once again, thank you guys very much for watching this video, and we will catch you guys all next week.